He wasn't Roman. He never lived in Rome. He didn't even speak Latin as his native tongue. And yet he was crowned Roman Emperor 4 centuries after the fall of Rome. It happened on Christmas Day in the old Basilica of St. Peter. A crowd applauded. The Pope placed the crown on his head, and thus was born an empire that would outlive Rome itself, the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne, the man who transformed a tribal kingdom into something resembling the EU, only with swords, monasteries, and hardline theology. And yet, a man who may have been outplayed by the Pope in front of all of Europe. If you enjoy deep, unhurried historical stories, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Europe in the 7th, 8th centuries was not merely the ruins of the Roman Empire. It was a landscape of memory and amnesia. Aqueducts still stood. Latin was heard in liturgy. The Pope sat in Rome, but no state could truly claim the legacy of imperial greatness. In this fractured reality, a tribe emerged without aristocratic Roman roots, but with ambition, swords, and exceptional political instinct. The Franks. Their rise didn't begin with Charlemagne, it began with institutional fatigue, when kings still reigned, but no longer ruled. The post-Roman Frankish kingdom had been ruled by the Merovingian dynasty, descendants of the semi-legendary Clovis. Merovingian kings wore long hair as a symbol of sacred rule, but with each generation, their real power waned. The true control of the realm lay with the mayors of the palace, the mayor domus, something like prime ministers in a world without parliaments. One of them, Pepin of Herstal, gathered so much power that his son, Charles Martel, was no longer just a chief administrator, but the de facto ruler of the Frankish realm. He became a legend of Christendom when he halted the Muslim advance at the Battle of Tours in 732. Yet Charles Martel never claimed the throne. He didn't want to provoke a clash with tradition. That step would be taken by his son. In 751, Pepin the Short, Charles Martel's son, decided to legalize what was already reality. He ruled but had no crown, so he turned to the one authority that could bless power more strongly than bloodline, the Pope. Who should be king, the man with the title or the man with the power? Pepin asked Pope Zachary. The Pope answered in a way that changed history, the one with the power. Pepin deposed the last Merovingian and became king himself, founding the Carolingian dynasty, but not without cost. The Pope would soon ask Pepin for military aid, and Pepin would answer. In 754, Pope Stephen II personally traveled to the Frankish lands to anoint Pepin and his sons. This was the first papal anointing of a king, a sacred act making power not just legal, but divinely sanctioned. In return, Pepin campaigned against the Lombards in Italy and granted a portion of their land to the papacy. Thus, the Papal States were born, a political body that had not existed in Roman times. Here began the chain reaction: spiritual legitimacy, military support, mutual benefit, that gave rise to something greater than a new dynasty. It birthed the idea that secular authority could be justified through divine sanction. This would become the foundation for what later would be called the Holy Roman Empire. At the time of Pepin's death in 768, his kingdom stretched from Brittany to Bavaria, from the Pyrenees to the Alps. But it was not yet an empire. It was still a tribal ethnic polity, weakly centralized, reliant on vassals, and increasingly shaped by monasteries that served as centers of learning and influence. And at this turning point, as old habits still governed, emerged Charles, Pepin's son, destined to become Charlemagne. Charlemagne ascended to the throne in 768 after the death of his father, Pepin the Short. Initially, power was shared with his brother Carloman, as was customary in Frankish tradition. But 3 years later, Carloman died unexpectedly, and Charles became the sole king of the Franks. Thus began a reign that in scope and consequence would become unparalleled in medieval Europe. Charlemagne's first mission was not to build an empire, but to survive and consolidate. His kingdom was not a monolith, but a patchwork of regions, tribes, and local rulers who obeyed more out of pragmatism than loyalty. But Charles had an advantage: a disciplined army, the backing of the church, and extraordinary stamina. Under his rule, the Frankish realm went to war nearly every year. One of his bloodiest campaigns was against the Saxons, pagan tribes in the northeast who fiercely resisted for 30 years. Charlemagne didn't just fight. He forcibly baptized, burned sacred groves, and destroyed temples. In the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, 782, refusal to be baptized became punishable by death. It was harsh, but effective. Saxony was absorbed, and Christianity became the official language of loyalty. Another major campaign was against the Avars, a nomadic people who controlled Pannonia, modern Hungary. In 796, Charlemagne dealt them a crushing blow, destroying the Avar ring, their power center. Their treasures were donated to the church, a symbolic gesture that Charles fought not just for territory, but for faith. And he didn't stop. Lombards in Italy, Arabs in Spain, Slavs to the east, all were either subdued or drawn into alliance. His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Carpathians, from the Pyrenees to the North Sea. But Charles didn't just conquer, he built. This building had two dimensions: administrative and cultural. Charlemagne created a network of counties and border regions, marches, ruled by local lords loyal to him. To keep them in check, he introduced the Missi Dominici, royal envoys who inspected provinces annually and reported directly to the king. This was something new for Europe, a vertical structure of authority rather than a purely feudal chain of loyalty. More important still was his cultural project, now known as the Carolingian Renaissance. At its heart, the revival of education, language, theology, and law. He gathered scholars from across the Christian world: Alcuin of York, Paul the deacon from Italy, Theodulf from Spain, to work at his court in Aachen. Charles mandated that every monastery have schools for boys, that monks be literate, and that Latin become the standard language of worship and administration. From this emerged the Carolingian minuscule, a script that would preserve and clarify classical texts. This wasn't just a cultural impulse. It was a state program of knowledge reconstruction. In a world steadily forgetting Rome, Charlemagne bet on memory. He wasn't an intellectual, but he was a strategist. He understood that empires are built not just on swords, but on manuscripts. And so, when Charlemagne looked at the map of his kingdom, he saw not just territory, he saw a space of unified faith, language, and governance. It was this vision and the power to enforce it that set the stage for his most unexpected move: imperial coronation. In 799, an unexpected guest arrived at Charlemagne's court in the Frankish kingdom, Pope Leo III. But he didn't come as a spiritual leader. He came as a fugitive. In Rome, there had been an assassination attempt against him. His tongue and eyes were partially mutilated, and only his escape to Charlemagne saved his life. This moment marked the climax of an old conflict between the Roman aristocracy and the papacy, which was struggling to maintain independence. But behind this drama lay a deeper issue: who controlled spiritual and secular power in Western Europe. Charlemagne received the Pope with honor, but didn't rush to conclusions. He sent an embassy, heard all sides, and staged what was essentially a medieval investigation, surprisingly modern for the 8th century. All signs pointed to Charlemagne traveling to Rome himself, not merely as protector, but as arbiter. In 800, he arrived in Rome with a large entourage. In December, Pope Leo publicly cleared himself by swearing on the Gospels. Then, just a few days later, on Christmas Day, came the event that would change the course of history. Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor. The coronation took place in the old Basilica of St. Peter. Charlemagne, according to legend, was kneeling in prayer. The Pope approached and placed the crown on his head without prior notice. The crowd shouted, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-bringing Emperor of the Romans, long life." What actually happened? Historians still debate it. Charlemagne himself later claimed he had no idea the coronation would happen, that if he had known, he wouldn't have entered the church. Others believe it was a choreographed political theater, where the Pope emphasized that he didn't submit to the emperor, but rather he created the emperor. Regardless, the deed was done. After nearly 4 centuries without a Western emperor since 476, Western Europe once again had a Roman ruler. But he wasn't Roman, Greek, or Latin. He was a Frank. And therein lay the paradox: an emperor without Rome, since Rome belonged to the Pope; without the East, since Constantinople didn't recognize him; and without the old institutions, since everything had been reinvented. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, saw this as usurpation. At the time, Empress Irene ruled in Constantinople, and under Roman law, she had the legitimate imperial claim. But the West pretended the East had faded, and thus the Roman crown could pass to a new, more worthy bearer. Charlemagne assumed the titles Emperor and Augustus, and his name was struck on coins with full imperial dignity. He became the first Western European since the fall of Rome to bear the title. But what did it mean? First, it was a symbolic coup. In a world where legitimacy depended on succession, Charlemagne established a new lineage, not from Caesar or Senate, but from the Church, via the Pope. Second, it was an alliance of sword and cross. The Pope needed a defender, and Charlemagne needed divine sanction. Third, it was the birth of a new imperial concept, not multicultural like Rome, but sacralized, Christian, with a mission. That Christmas of 800 saw more than the rise of a new ruler. It saw the birth of a European model, one that would live on for 1,000 years. After the coronation in 800, Charlemagne became the first Western emperor in nearly 4 centuries. But a title alone does not make an empire. Unlike Byzantium, where the emperor ruled a centralized bureaucracy, Charlemagne had neither an imperial capital, nor a class of career officials, nor a hereditary tradition of Roman law. His empire was a realm of personal rule, vast, diverse, and fragile. On the map, it looked impressive, but in reality, everything depended on relationships, oaths, and Charlemagne's personal reputation. His empire was a human network, not an abstract apparatus of power. At its core was a system of counties and marches, governed by local elites. They collected taxes, raised troops, administered justice. To prevent excessive autonomy, Charlemagne created a unique oversight mechanism, the Missi Dominici, Lord's envoys, who traveled in pairs, usually a bishop and a count, to inspect provinces, deliver royal orders, and gather complaints. It was a primitive form of audit administration, but it held the state together. Another tool was legislation, the capitularia. Charlemagne regularly convened assemblies where these legal codes were issued. They regulated everything: inheritance, military service, education, even monogamy. But this wasn't law in the Roman sense. These were commandments of a powerful ruler grounded in custom, Christian values, and momentary need. The church played an increasingly central role. Charlemagne saw it as a tool of unity. It educated, preached, disciplined. He encouraged the building of monasteries, the study of Latin, and the copying of biblical texts. In his Admonitio Generalis, he wrote that ignorance of sacred texts endangered not just the soul, but the state. Thus was born the ideal of Rex et Sacerdos, the ruler as spiritual overseer. At the center of the empire stood Aachen, Charlemagne's residence. He built a palace, a chapel, convened synods, and hosted a royal school. Here, a unique atmosphere emerged, an intellectual elite working to support imperial unity. The empire had no capital like Constantinople, but it had a symbolic center, Aachen, as the Rome of the North. And yet, even at its height, the empire was a fragile construction, held together by three forces: Charlemagne's personal authority, vassal oaths, unity of faith. None of these were eternal. But while Charlemagne lived, the empire functioned. It was a fusion of tradition, innovation, religion, force, and charisma. And though it was called Roman, it had little in common with the Senate or Roman jurisprudence. It was a new project where Romanness meant legitimacy, not continuity. In letters to Byzantium, Charlemagne called himself Rex et Imperator, king and emperor. But the East didn't recognize him. Byzantium saw him as an usurper. That didn't bother the West. For Charlemagne, the appearance of power mattered more than formal recognition. Paradoxically, it was precisely the weakness of state institutions in the West that allowed Charlemagne to become emperor. Where no system existed, he could create one. This was not an empire in the Roman or Byzantine sense. It was a Frankish empire built from practice, energy, willpower, and a belief in its own divine mission. In official history, Charlemagne stands as the embodiment of order, discipline, and unity. Yet in his own household, he created a paradox: the patriarch who never allowed his daughters to marry. Why? He had at least 18 children, including around 9 daughters, and not one of them was married during his lifetime. This was no coincidence. It was a deliberate policy. Charlemagne believed that marrying off his daughters posed a political risk. Through marriage, they could become pawns in power games. If one wed a powerful nobleman, he might claim the throne or stir dynastic unrest. In a world where every marriage was a political maneuver, Charlemagne chose absolute control. But his daughters, educated, spirited women raised in a refined court culture, had no desire to become cloistered nuns. They lived at court, played music, read Latin poetry, corresponded with scholars, and they had lovers. Yes, Despite the emperor's stern image, the Aachen court harbored a hidden life of the heart. Contemporary chronicles mention that Charlemagne's daughters had unofficial partners, and some bore children. One of the most noted was Bertha, who had a son who later became a poet. So how did Charlemagne react? Did he punish them? Shame them? No. His love for his daughters was deep. He allowed them to live at court with their children, avoided public condemnation. They were, as chroniclers noted, the only visible tenderness in his iron soul. He denied them freedom, yet did not destroy its shadow. This was paternalism of a new kind, power that controls but does not crush. Yet one affair may have turned dangerous. According to Notker the Stammerer, one of Charlemagne's close associates, Einhard, the scholar and architect who wrote the life of Charlemagne, may have had a romantic relationship with the emperor's daughter Emma. The story is half legend, but fascinating. It said Charlemagne disapproved of the affair, but eventually relented, perhaps after Emma threatened to leave the court. He allegedly allowed a secret marriage. In another version, he only learned of it after his death. Either way, the story reveals a deeper truth. Charlemagne's ability to manage even personal passions, not without authority, but not without humanity. This episode matters not just as gossip. It shows that Charlemagne's empire was not only a political and religious project, but also a laboratory of social norms. His daughters became symbols of forbidden freedom, educated, powerful, yet trapped within patriarchal bounds. And Charlemagne, a man who built an empire, feared his daughters' marriages more than Viking invasions. Charlemagne died in 814 at his residence in Aachen. He was about 72 years old, an almost biblical age for medieval Europe. His body was buried in the palace chapel with a simple inscription on his tomb, Carolo Magno, to Charles the Great. One might think that such an empire was built to last forever, but it had already begun to crack during his lifetime. Charlemagne ruled personally until the end, never creating a system of succession that could function without him. The only surviving son, Louis the Pious, inherited the crown, but not the charisma or authority. Louis wanted to rule as a Christian, gently, peacefully, through reform. He convened synods, fought corruption, tried to educate the elite. But in 817, he made a fatal mistake. He divided the empire among his sons while still alive, hoping to preserve unity through partition. The result was the opposite: civil wars, conspiracies, strife. His sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, turned against one another. The empire that Charlemagne had built over decades collapsed in just a few years. In 843, they signed the Treaty of Verdun, dividing the empire into three parts: West Francia, future France; East Francia, future Germany; Middle Kingdom, stretching from the Netherlands to Italy. This treaty is often seen as the beginning of modern European nations. But for imperial unity, it was de facto burial. On top of civil war came external threats: Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, Saracens from the south. The Carolingian model of defense crumbled. By the late 9th century, the empire had lost control over its peripheries, vassals acted independently, and kings became figureheads. And yet, most paradoxically, the idea of empire did not vanish. On the contrary, even in fragmentation, every ruler tried to claim he was the true heir of Charlemagne. This was especially fierce in Italy, where the struggle for the imperial crown never ceased. In 962, Otto the Firstborn Archduke of Saxony and King of Germany, was crowned emperor by the Pope. Thus, the title of Holy Roman Emperor was officially revived, now in the hands of the German kings. It was a new cycle, a renewed alliance of sword and cross. But at its heart lay the shadow of Charlemagne. His empire was gone, but its spirit lived on as a political ghost, a benchmark of greatness to be emulated. That's why the Holy Roman Empire would formally survive until 1806, though for most of its existence it had neither strength nor centralization. Its meaning was not in governance, but in the symbolic idea of Christian unity in Europe. In that sense, Charlemagne achieved more than he may have realized. He didn't create a lasting state. He created an idea that outlived his physical empire by 1,000 years. Imagine this: a ruler dies, his empire falls apart, his heirs feud. Centuries later, his tomb is opened to verify if he's still seated on his throne, even in death. This is not legend, this is Charlemagne. In 1165, on the orders of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Charlemagne's tomb was opened. According to chroniclers, he was indeed seated on a golden throne, the Gospels resting on his lap. His body was intact, preserved like a saint. This wasn't just memory. It was a political canonization. Charlemagne as the Saint Empereur, the West's new Constantine. Charlemagne became not just a historical figure, he became an archetype. In the Middle Ages, everyone invoked his name. Emperors craving legitimacy, popes seeking allies, monks building new schools, bards composing epic tales. He was exalted as Pater Europae, Father of Europe, and the title was no exaggeration. Charlemagne was the first to unite such diverse peoples, Germans, Gauls, Lombards, Burgundians, not by erasing their identities, but by binding them to a shared order. His realm was the first real attempt at a European union, albeit forged by conquest. He created a precedent for empire as a unifying force, not necessarily wealthy, not necessarily urban, but sacralized. Culturally, he was the engine of revival. Without his reforms, his court academy, his standardization of script, we might have lost much of ancient knowledge. It was his monks who preserved Cicero, Virgil, Boethius. His empire was a bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages. At the same time, Charlemagne was no modern saint. He was stern, often brutal, always pragmatic. He executed thousands of Saxons, crushed revolts mercilessly, challenged the Pope when it suited him. And in that contradiction lies his uniqueness, a man of his time who transcended it. His legacy isn't about replicating his model, it's about transforming chaos into structure, faith into policy, tradition into instruments of power. About building unity where others saw only division. Charlemagne's name remained a symbol of legitimacy for centuries. French kings, German emperors, even Napoleon invoked it. Even the European Union in the 1950s created the Charlemagne Prize, its highest honor for contributions to European unity. This wasn't just homage. It was an acknowledgement that Charlemagne's idea still breathes. Here lies the paradox. Charlemagne's empire collapsed, but his vision of a Europe bound by order, faith, learning, and strength outlived all empires that came after him. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's dramatic crossroads. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? What stories would you like us to explore next? Perhaps another legendary ruler, a forgotten revolution, or a scandal that changed everything. We'd love to hear from you.